They were dragged from their homelands in chains, forced onto ships bound for a world they never asked for. But their story didn't end in silence. It reshaped continents, cultures, and the very foundation of the New World. This is the true beginning of the African diaspora. Before chains rattled in the hulls of ships and the Atlantic waves bore human cargo toward the Americas, the roots of the African slave trade were already coiling beneath centuries of political ambition, warfare, and profit. The 1500s would bring transformation, but the seeds were planted long before in the soil of African kingdoms and the aspirations of European empires. West Africa in the 15th century was not a monolith of helpless tribes awaiting conquest. It was a continent of empires, the Songhai stretching across the Sahel, the Kingdom of Benin rising in influence, the Congo flourishing in the Central Basin. These were powerful societies, often governed by complex systems of law, religion, and commerce. They were skilled diplomats, traders, artisans, and warriors. And they had long been involved in systems of servitude, though not in the racialized, brutal chattel slavery that Europe would soon impose. African slavery before European contact was often tied to war, debt, or punishment, more akin to indentured servitude. Enslaved individuals could marry, own property, and even rise to positions of authority. However, that changed when European merchants, led first by Portugal, arrived on West Africa's Atlantic shores not just to trade goods, but also to buy people. By the mid-1400s, Portuguese explorers like Diogo Cao and Prince Henry the Navigator were establishing trading posts along the African coast. Their goals were clear: control commerce, convert souls, and extract wealth. At first, they traded with African rulers for gold, ivory, and spices. But soon, the Portuguese realized something else could be commodified: human lives. African rulers, recognizing the opportunity, engaged with the trade. They offered captives taken in local wars or raids in exchange for guns, textiles, horses, and European goods. This demand for captives began to reshape regional power dynamics. Warlords and kings grew stronger by capturing more people to sell. Communities that had once coexisted in uneasy peace found new incentives for conflict. The trade in human beings, once limited and ritualized, began to scale up, not by African design, but by European demand. And that demand was growing. The Portuguese had begun colonizing Atlantic islands such as Madeira, Cape Verde, and São Tomé, remote outposts ideal for sugar cultivation. But sugar was labor-intensive and deadly to produce. European settlers couldn't survive the heat or disease. Enslaved Africans, they concluded, were the solution. Thus began a cycle. West Africa would supply enslaved labor. The Atlantic islands would refine the sugar model, and soon the New World would beckon with even greater profits. By 1500, the system was already thriving. In the Kingdom of Congo, King Nzinga Nkuvu had converted to Christianity and taken the name João I after meeting Portuguese missionaries. His son, Afonso I, would later write to the King of Portugal, begging him to stop unauthorized slavers from devastating his people, even as he himself participated in the trade. It was a paradox repeated across the continent. African leaders both resisted and enabled the trade, trapped in a system that brought power and destruction in equal measure. Meanwhile, in Europe, moral justifications were already forming. The Catholic Church had sanctioned slavery under the guise of converting non-Christians. Papal bulls issued in the 1450s granted Portugal the right to enslave infidels in Africa. The seeds of racial ideology, that Africans were somehow lesser and therefore suited for enslavement, were being planted not only in policy, but in religious doctrine and popular imagination. The economic system was now taking shape. Slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was foundational. Portuguese merchants set up feitorias, or fortified trading posts, along the coast. From Elmina to Luanda, these became hubs of the growing human trade. Captives were marched hundreds of miles to coastal barracoons, held in brutal conditions until they could be loaded onto ships. But these early movements of people were just the beginning. As the century turned and European powers began exploring the Americas in earnest, what had started as a coastal trade would soon explode into a transoceanic system of exploitation. Millions would be caught in its wake. For Africa, it would mean depopulation, destabilization, and centuries of suffering. For the Americas, it would mean the birth of plantation economies soaked in blood. And for the world, the forging of a diaspora that would echo across time, culture, and history. The roots of the trade were deep. By the time the ships began crossing the Atlantic in earnest, the system was already in motion. A convergence of African complexity and European cruelty that would forever alter the world's trajectory. Before the vast plantations of Brazil, before the packed slave ships crossed regularly to the Americas, Portugal conducted a series of brutal experiments, out of sight but never out of consequence, on a handful of Atlantic islands. These experiments would become the blueprint for the transatlantic slave trade. The islands were the laboratories. Enslaved Africans were the test subjects. It began with Madeira. Discovered by the Portuguese in 1419 and settled in the 1420s, Madeira was lush, volcanic, and fertile. Perfect for sugarcane. But sugar was no ordinary crop. It demanded immense labor, ceaseless toil, and constant maintenance. European settlers soon realized they could not meet these demands on their own. So they imported enslaved labor, first from North Africa, then from further south. As sugar plantations multiplied, so did the need for labor. The model hardened. A small elite of European landowners controlling large numbers of enslaved Africans. The plantations were monocultures, devoted entirely to the cultivation of sugar. The mill, the engenho, became the central engine of production, both economically and socially. It dominated the landscape, and its demand for human suffering was relentless. Next came the Cape Verde Islands and São Tomé. Cape Verde, settled in the mid-15th century, became a critical hub in the growing slave trade. Its strategic location off the West African coast allowed Portugal to ship enslaved Africans in, season them in bondage, and ship them out again to other colonies. But it was São Tomé that perfected the formula. Located near the equator in the Gulf of Guinea, São Tomé had the climate and soil for large-scale sugar production. By the late 1400s, it was running on the plantation model that would later be exported wholesale to the Americas. Africans, captured in raids or traded by African kingdoms, were transported to the island in chains. There, they lived and died in back-breaking cycles of work. Mortality rates were staggering, but profit margins were high. The system worked, at least for the colonizers. The Atlantic islands had shown Portugal that sugar, powered by enslaved labor, could bring immense wealth, and wealth, in turn, bred imitation. When Brazil was claimed by Portugal in 1500, it wasn't a blank slate. It was an opportunity to replicate what had already been tested. And the Portuguese would do it on a scale that dwarfed their island experiments. But first, they needed infrastructure, ships, and a network. That's where the triangular trade began to take shape. Goods from Europe, such as textiles, firearms, and metal tools, were shipped to Africa and exchanged for people. Those people were then transported across the Atlantic to Brazil and the Caribbean, where they were forced to labor in sugar plantations. The sugar they produced, along with tobacco, cotton, and later coffee, was shipped back to Europe, fueling consumer markets and filling royal coffers. Portugal's role was central. Lisbon became one of the key ports of the slave trade. Wealth poured in, not just from sugar, but from the trade in human beings. Portuguese merchants, royal officials, and plantation owners all had stakes in the system. The crown licensed contracts, known as asientos, granting merchants the right to sell enslaved people in its colonies. The business of slavery was sanctioned, organized, and legal. Religion provided cover. Missionaries baptized the enslaved, claiming they were saving souls even as they destroyed bodies. The church did not condemn the trade. Some of its members profited from it. And theology, twisted by greed, helped justify the commodification of millions. But Portugal's Atlantic experiments were not just economic. They were also cultural and racial. On the islands, for the first time, Europeans began to draw rigid lines between themselves and the African laborers they controlled. Skin color became a marker of status. Religion became a tool of assimilation and control. The concept of perpetual servitude, rooted in race rather than crime or war, took root. Slavery was no longer just a consequence of conflict. It was an inherited condition, a birthright of bondage. This racialization of labor would become one of the most insidious exports of the Atlantic system. In São Tomé, Cape Verde, and Madeira, you can trace its beginnings. But it was Brazil that would make it law. By the early 1500s, Portuguese ships were sailing regularly between West Africa and Brazil. The sugar plantations in Pernambuco and Bahia were expanding. The number of enslaved Africans crossing the ocean grew steadily. The Atlantic had become a highway of human misery, and Portugal had paved it. The Atlantic experiments had proven something terrible, that with enough violence, coercion, and organization, an empire could be built on stolen labor. Others, including Spain, Britain, France, and the Dutch, would adopt that lesson. But it was Portugal that laid the foundations. The Atlantic islands were small, isolated places, but they played a monumental role in shaping the modern world. Their sugar mills and slave pens were prototypes of the future. Their horrors became templates, and the enslaved men, women, and children who perished there were the first casualties in what would become the largest forced migration in human history. By the mid-1500s, Portugal had found its crown jewel, not in Asia, not on its Atlantic islands, but across the ocean in a massive, resource-rich land that would become the beating heart of its empire, Brazil. And at the center of Brazil's rise stood a crop that consumed everything around it: land, labor, and lives. Sugar. The plantations in coastal Brazil, particularly in regions such as Pernambuco and Bahia, had evolved from small experiments into vast engines of production. The land was fertile. The climate was ideal. The Atlantic breeze cooled the cane fields just enough to keep the work going throughout the year. But none of this mattered without one critical element: labor. The indigenous people had resisted. Many fled inland. Others died from European diseases or were killed in raids. While some were enslaved in brutal campaigns known as wars of enslavement, their numbers were not sufficient. Portugal turned fully to the system it had tested on its Atlantic islands. Brazil would become the new hub of African slavery. The transatlantic slave trade accelerated rapidly. From West Africa, Angola, Congo, Guinea, and beyond, tens of thousands of enslaved people were loaded onto Portuguese ships. The voyage across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a hell unlike any other. Crammed below deck in suffocating holds, Africans endured weeks, sometimes months, of starvation, disease, and abuse. Mortality rates were staggering. 1 in 5 would not survive the journey. But this was a numbers game. For every body lost, more would be taken. By the early 1600s, Brazil had surpassed every other colony in the New World in its reliance on enslaved African labor. The country wasn't just importing enslaved people, it was consuming them. Sugar mills, engenhos, dotted the coasts, each one a self-contained world of cruelty. The enslaved rose before dawn and labored until nightfall. Cutting sugarcane was exhausting and dangerous. The knives were sharp, The cane was heavy. The work never ended. Inside the mills, boiling vats of sugar juice filled the air with heat and the stench of burning. Accidents were common. Limbs lost, skin scalded, voices silenced. What was the life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Brazilian plantation? Often less than 10 years. Unlike some English or Spanish colonies, where enslaved people were expected to reproduce and sustain the labor force, Portuguese Brazil treated enslaved people as expendable tools, replaceable, disposable, and endlessly profitable. When one died, another could be bought. There was always another ship arriving, and arrive they did. Brazil alone would go on to receive nearly 40% of all Africans forcibly brought to the Americas, more than any other nation. Over 4.8 million people, 4 times the size of the United States. This was not a side note in Brazil's history. It was its foundation. Every element of colonial Brazilian society, from agriculture to architecture, religion to language, was shaped by the African presence. Enslaved people didn't just labor, they built. They irrigated fields, carved roads, and constructed cities like Salvador and Rio de Janeiro. They brought music, rhythm, and resistance. But they did so in chains. Portugal's colonial administration profited immensely. So did the Catholic Church. Enslavers were encouraged to baptize their captives, even as they whipped them. The crown taxed every enslaved person sold, treating the human body as a revenue stream. Merchants, nobles, and planters formed a powerful alliance, all of whom were invested in the continued flow of African bodies into Brazil. But the enslaved resisted. They ran. They fought. They formed Quilombos, communities of escaped enslaved people hidden in the dense forests or mountains. The most famous was Palmares, a sprawling settlement in the northeast that would survive nearly a century, defying colonial forces, building its own society of freedom in the heart of a slave empire. But for every Palmares, there were 100 plantations. For every rebel, 1,000 more were shackled. As the sugar economy boomed, Brazil's identity fused with slavery. It wasn't just economic, it was cultural, legal, and deeply racialized. Laws were passed defining enslaved people as property. Children inherited the status of their mothers. Manumission, freedom, was possible, but rare. Racial hierarchies were solidified, justifying cruelty with the myth of white superiority and divine sanction. The consequences rippled outward. Europeans feasted on sugar. Cafes in Lisbon and London served sweetened drinks, unaware or indifferent to the chains that made them possible. Portugal's economy surged. African kingdoms, seduced or coerced, became intermediaries in the trade. And Brazil, so far from Lisbon, so massive in land, became the empire's blood-soaked frontier. By the 17th century, Brazil was not just another colony. It was the engine of the Portuguese Empire. And that engine ran on slavery. They arrived in chains, but they didn't come empty. Stripped of their names, languages, and families, the enslaved Africans brought to the Americas carried something the colonizers could never take: their culture. In Brazil and across the New World, African traditions, spiritual, musical, culinary, and communal, began to root themselves in foreign soil. Despite unimaginable suffering, the enslaved found ways to preserve identity, remember ancestry, and resist cultural erasure. In the sugar plantations of Bahia or the gold mines of Minas Gerais, African voices echoed in work songs. Drums carved from local trees kept rhythms first played in Angola, Congo, or Yoruba lands. Call and response chants emerged not only as a means of communication across fields, but also as subtle forms of resistance. Coded messages, spiritual invocations, or shared defiance in the face of oppression. Religion, too, transformed. The Portuguese Catholic Church demanded conversion. Every enslaved African was to be baptized, every child raised Christian. But beneath the surface of Christian rituals, African spirituality endured. The result was syncretism, the blending of belief systems into something new, something both hidden and powerful. In Brazil, enslaved Yoruba and Bantu peoples developed what would become candomblé, a religion that outwardly resembled Catholicism but honored African deities known as orixás. These spiritual figures were often paired with Catholic saints, Ogum, the god of iron and war, with Saint George, Yemanja, goddess of the sea, with the Virgin Mary. Altars were set in secret, ceremonies held under the moon. The drum beats, the dances, the chants, all whispered the names of gods that had crossed oceans in silence. Language was another battlefield. The enslaved arrived speaking dozens of dialects, including Kikongo, Kimbundu, Yoruba, and Yue. Over time, these merged with Portuguese, forming Creole languages and Afro-Portuguese dialects. Even today, Brazilian Portuguese is filled with African loanwords, words for food, tools, animals, even emotions, unacknowledged footprints of Africa's enduring presence. Food, too, told a story of survival and innovation. Cassava, brought from indigenous people, was combined with African techniques to make farofa. Stews like feijoada, a now iconic Brazilian dish, emerged from the scraps given to enslaved people. Black beans, pork fat, unwanted cuts, spices, and cooking methods from West Africa turned starvation rations into meals of cultural resilience. In the Quilombos, hidden settlements of escaped enslaved people, African governance structures took root. Councils of elders, oral law, collective farming, defense networks. These communities preserved not only freedom, but also the memory of the homeland. They became living archives of Africa in exile. Art, too, bore witness. Wood carvings, masks, and textiles incorporated African motifs. Hairstyles told stories, braided maps, symbols of tribal origin, messages of identity. Dance became a form of coded movement. Capoeira, born in the Quilombos and practiced under the guise of a martial dance, was a deadly self-defense system rooted in African combat traditions. Banned by the Portuguese, feared by the enslavers, capoeira was not just movement. It was rebellion in rhythm. Even naming practices defied domination. Though baptized with Christian names, many enslaved Africans kept or reinvented names that echoed their origins. They whispered ancestral titles behind closed doors. They passed down secret genealogies, mother to daughter, father to son, as quiet declarations. We are not erased. We are not forgotten. And in moments of silence, at nightfall, during stolen gatherings, in lullabies hummed to newborns, the enslaved sang of rivers they'd never see again, of stars that shone above a different sky, of gods who had followed them in silence. These weren't just memories. They were acts of preservation. And in many ways, they were acts of war. Colonial authorities tried to suppress it all. Drums were banned. Gatherings were outlawed. Punishments for practicing African religion were severe. But suppression failed. Culture, like water, finds a way. Over time, the very identity of Brazil, its music, cuisine, religion, and art, would be shaped by these African roots. Samba, axe, afoxe, the rhythms of carnival, the flavor of dande oil, the prayers whispered at crossroads. Brazil was no longer just a European colony. It was becoming a fusion, a continent reborn from pain, survival, and cultural resistance. But this fusion came at a terrible cost. Behind every dish, every dance, every drumbeat, there were chains. The preservation of African culture in the New World is a story not just of survival, but of genius forged in the midst of suffering. It is the story of a people who, though forcibly taken from their homeland, refused to be stripped of their identity. They were expected to be silent, to work, to suffer, to die quietly in the sugar fields or gold mines, faceless and forgotten. But across the New World, enslaved Africans defied that expectation, sometimes with fire, sometimes with flight, and sometimes with nothing but the quiet power of refusal. In the dense interior jungles of Brazil, the whispered word was Quilombo. It meant refuge, freedom, war. Quilombos were more than just hideouts. They were entire communities of escaped enslaved people, often fortified, sometimes organized like small kingdoms. The most legendary of them all was Quilombo dos Palmares. Hidden in the northeastern mountains of present-day Alagoas, Palmares began as a gathering of fugitives in the early 1600s. However, over the decades, it evolved into a formidable state. At its height, it housed more than 20,000 people. Escaped enslaved people, indigenous allies, even poor whites fleeing Portuguese control. It had a council of leaders, an elected king, agriculture, defense systems, and iron forging workshops. It was everything the colonial authorities feared, an African kingdom rising inside their empire. And its most famous leader? Zumbi. Born in Palmares, raised as a warrior, and remembered today as a national hero. Zumbi symbolized not just resistance, but black sovereignty. Under his leadership, Palmares resisted wave after wave of Portuguese and Dutch attacks for decades. When it finally fell in 1694, it took a full-scale military campaign, cannons, fire, and betrayal. But Palmares was not the only rebellion. Across Brazil, uprisings flared like sparks in dry brush. In 1807, the Bahia slave revolt shook Salvador, one of the largest slave ports in the world. Enslaved Muslim Africans, many of them Yoruba and Hausa, planned to seize weapons, overthrow the colonial government, and create an Islamic state. Though it was foiled before it began, the scale of the plot terrified colonial officials. They realized the enslaved were not ignorant laborers. They were educated, organized, and ideologically united. Resistance wasn't always open warfare. Sometimes it was sabotage, deliberate accidents in the fields, refusal to speak Portuguese, work slowed to a crawl, tools broken, sugarcane burned, food poisoned. The enslaved found countless ways to resist the machinery of slavery from the inside. Religion became both a hiding place and a weapon. In secret ceremonies, enslaved Africans invoked orixás for protection and revenge. Spirits were called not just to bless, but to strike. Rituals were held to curse enslavers or protect escapees. These weren't just spiritual moments. They were acts of rebellion in a world where faith had been colonized. Music carried messages. Drums weren't just instruments. They were communication tools. They transmitted warnings, mapped escape routes, or rallied courage. Colonial laws often banned drums entirely, fearing their power. But the rhythms never honestly stopped. They went underground, adapting and disguising themselves in church festivals or folk rituals. Even family became an act of defiance. Colonial law denied enslaved people the right to marry or raise children with stability. Families were torn apart by sale or punishment. However, in every Quilombo, and even within the slave quarters, people chose their partners. They formed bonds, raised children, and told stories from the homeland. In a system built to dehumanize, love became resistance. Punishment for rebellion was brutal. Torture, whippings, death. Entire families punished for one act of defiance. Yet the rebellions didn't stop. Because behind every escape, every uprising, every sabotage, there was a single unkillable truth. Freedom was worth dying for. The colonial authorities saw enslaved people as property, tools, numbers. But these rebellions proved otherwise. They showed that even the most broken body could contain an unbroken will. By the late 1700s and into the 1800s, the drumbeat of resistance grew louder. News of the Haitian Revolution spread across the Americas. Enslaved people had overthrown a European empire and declared independence. In Brazil, it was like a match to dry leaves. The elite grew nervous. The enslaved grew hopeful. Quilombos multiplied. Urban revolts grew more daring. Secret societies of black and mixed-race Brazilians formed networks. The streets of Salvador, Rio, and Recife whispered rebellion. Some of these uprisings failed. Some succeeded briefly. But each one chipped away at the lie that the enslaved were passive. Each one reminded the colonizers that they were surrounded by people who had not accepted bondage. Not in their minds, not in their hearts, not in their gods. And when freedom finally came in Brazil, not until 1888, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, it was not a gift. It was the result of centuries of rebellion, sacrifice, and resistance, both seen and unseen. The history of slavery in the New World is not just a history of chains. It's a history of fighting back of stolen lives that still found ways to shout, to sing, to strike, to run. Not just victims, resistors, survivors, fighters. To understand how slavery endured for centuries, we must follow the money. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't fueled by cruelty alone. It was built on profit. Human suffering was converted into currency. Across Europe and the Americas, kings, merchants, planters, and investors grew rich, while millions of African lives were destroyed. Enslavement was not a tragic error. It was a calculated business. And Brazil was one of its most profitable branches. By the mid-1500s, sugar had become the beating heart of Brazil's economy. The northeastern coast, with its humid climate and fertile soil, was perfect for sugarcane cultivation. Portuguese colonists, backed by royal charters and merchant guilds, constructed sprawling sugar plantations known as engenhos. But sugar is a demanding crop. It requires brutal labor, round-the-clock attention, and constant replanting. Indigenous labor had failed, not because the native people were weak, but because they resisted, escaped, or perished under European diseases. The Portuguese needed a new workforce. They turned to Africa. Each enslaved African brought to Brazil had a price, but also a projected return on investment. A healthy young man might cost the equivalent of thousands in today's dollars. But if he survived just a few years, the sugar he harvested, pressed, and boiled would generate far more. Plantation owners calculated their slaves' lifespans, output, and replacement rate like inventory. It was cheaper to work someone to death and buy another than to offer rest or care. And so the Transatlantic Triangle formed, one of history's most horrifying financial systems. From Europe, ships sailed with manufactured goods, including cloth, guns, metal tools, and alcohol. These were traded in West Africa for people, often captured through wars stoked by European demand. Those human beings were packed into ships and sent across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was not just a journey. It was a nightmare. Cramped in chains, lying in their own waste, suffocated in dark hulls, enslaved Africans suffered weeks, sometimes months, at sea. Mortality rates were high. Perhaps 1 in every 5 died before ever reaching shore. But that didn't stop the ships from sailing. The profits outweighed the losses. Upon arrival in Brazil, the survivors were sold at auction. Families were separated. People were branded like cattle. Many were sent straight to the plantations. Others went to the gold mines of Minas Gerais, the cattle fields of the interior, or the ports of Rio and Salvador. From there, the products of slavery, including sugar, gold, tobacco, cotton, and later coffee, flowed back to Europe, enriching Portuguese cities such as Lisbon and Porto. The cycle repeated endlessly. Slavery wasn't a side effect of colonization. It was the engine. It funded the rise of Brazil's cities. It built the colonial elite. It shaped Brazil's land ownership, legal system, and class hierarchy. Enslaved labor was so central to Brazil's economy that by the 1700s, more than half the population was enslaved. No other colony in the Americas held as many enslaved people for so long. The effects of this economy went beyond Brazil. The wealth created by enslaved labor in the Americas helped fund the rise of European empires. Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands all depended on the output of enslaved people. The gold extracted in Brazil propped up the Portuguese crown. The sugar-fueled European markets sweetened their diets. Even banks, insurance companies, and universities in Europe profited. Many were founded or sustained by wealth tied to slavery. Even as Enlightenment thinkers in Europe began discussing liberty, human rights, and equality, they either invested in or ignored the system of slavery that made those freedoms possible for themselves. The contradictions were staggering, but the profits were greater. By the 1800s, Brazil had shifted from sugar to coffee as its dominant export. However, the business model remained unchanged. Enslaved Africans, and later their descendants born into bondage, were the foundation. Every bag of coffee beans, every spoon of sugar, every nugget of gold had a hidden cost measured in broken bodies and stolen lives. Resistance remained constant, but so did economic dependency. Even when some European countries began abolishing slavery, Brazil held on. Too much money was at stake. Too many fortunes had been built. Many politicians, priests, and intellectuals had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Eventually, abolition came. But the economic legacy of slavery didn't vanish. It remained etched into Brazil's social fabric. In its land ownership patterns, its wealth gaps, its racial hierarchies, the descendants of enslaved people were left with freedom on paper, but poverty in practice. Today, when we speak of slavery, it is easy to focus only on the brutality, the whips, the chains, the misery. But to truly understand it, we must see the balance sheets, the ledgers, the ships, the markets. Slavery in the New World was not just cruel. It was capitalism. At its most unrestrained, its most violent, and its most enduring. Slavery tried to erase identity, but culture remembers. In the belly of the ships, in the fields of Brazil, and in the shadows of colonial churches, millions of enslaved Africans carried with them more than chains. They brought language, memory, rhythm, and spirit. And though their names were stripped, their bodies branded, and their families torn apart, something deeper endured: culture. This is the story of how enslaved Africans in Brazil resisted not just through rebellion, but also through remembrance. From the start of the transatlantic slave trade, Africans came from diverse regions. Yoruba from present-day Nigeria, Bantu speakers from Central Africa, Ewe and Fon from the Gold Coast, and many others. Each group arrived with distinct beliefs, rituals, stories, and languages. Portuguese colonists, in their arrogance, called them all Negroes, assuming sameness. They were wrong. These people brought kingdoms within them. Despite the trauma of capture and the horror of the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans in Brazil began reconstructing fragments of home. Sometimes it started with a whispered song, a drumbeat tapped on a wooden wall, a prayer murmured before sunrise. These echoes became lifelines. In Bahia, the Yoruba spiritual system evolved into candomblé, a rich Afro-Brazilian religion that blended traditional African deities, known as orixás, with Catholic saints. Outwardly, it looked like Christian worship. But behind the veil of saints like Saint Anthony or Our Lady of the Conception stood Ogun, the god of iron, and Iemanjá, goddess of the sea. Through this sacred disguise, enslaved people preserved their co-cultural and spiritual smology. Colonial authorities tried to suppress these practices, branding them heresy or witchcraft. But the enslaved resisted through adaptation. They held ceremonies in secret. They disguised rituals as Catholic processions. They embedded stories in folktales and rhythms in labor songs. Faith became resistance, not just spiritual, but cultural. Music was another battlefield and a weapon. Africans in Brazil developed rhythms that defied European structure. Syncopated, polyrhythmic, alive. They turned their bodies into instruments, their breath into song. In the fields, call and response chants helped coordinate labor and preserve ancestral languages. These sounds evolved over centuries into samba, maracatu, and other cornerstones of Brazilian music. Even the act of dancing became a form of subversion. Take capoeira, for instance, the acrobatic, dance-like martial art born in Quilombos and sugar plantations. To the colonists, it appeared to be a harmless game. In reality, it was a disguised form of combat training, a way for the enslaved to prepare for escape or defense. Capoeira blended African movement, music, and cunning. Today, it is a national symbol, but it was born in chains. Then there was language. African tongues were suppressed, but they never vanished. In markets, ports, and plantations, enslaved people blended Portuguese with Yoruba, Kimbundu, and Kikongo, creating creoles and dialects that carried ancestral syntax and idioms. Words like axe, spiritual energy, Quilombo, a runaway settlement, and mukama, maidservant, reveal Africa's fingerprint on Brazilian Portuguese. In kitchens, cultural fusion thrived. Cassava, a staple food from indigenous peoples, combined with African techniques and spices, gave rise to dishes like acarajé, vatapá, and feijoada, meals that now represent Brazil's culinary soul. Each plate told a story of survival. However, perhaps the greatest act of cultural resistance was the preservation of memory. In a world designed to dehumanize, remembering where you came from was defiance. Naming a child after an ancestor, braiding hair in traditional patterns, teaching a proverb whispered by a grandmother long gone. These were quiet revolutions. Over generations, new Afro-Brazilian identities formed, not copies of Africa, but something hybrid, resilient, and rooted in resistance. Enslaved people became culture makers. They did not simply endure slavery. They reshaped the world around them through their presence. Even in the face of unspeakable violence, they left legacies that endure today. In Brazil's music, religion, food, language, and art. Walk the streets of Salvador, listen to the drums of Recife, or watch a samba parade in Rio, and you'll see Africa beating beneath the surface. But for centuries, these contributions were ignored, criminalized, or whitewashed. Afro-Brazilian religions were banned. Capoeira was outlawed until the 20th century. African heritage was seen as shameful. Only recently has Brazil begun to acknowledge and celebrate the cultural genius that emerged from captivity. The enslaved may have been shackled, but their spirits weren't. Through rhythm, ritual, and memory, they carved out spaces of autonomy, pockets of freedom within oppression. Their culture was not a casualty of slavery. It was its antidote, and it lived on. Freedom in Brazil did not come with a bang, but with a slow, reluctant shuffle. While other nations abolished slavery with declarations, wars, or revolution, Brazil dragged its feet for centuries. Even as it became the last country in the Western world to outlaw slavery in 1888, the path to that moment was not paved by royal mercy. It was clawed forward by uprisings, court petitions, public pressure, international shame, and the sheer, unbreakable will of the enslaved. Throughout the 1700s and early 1800s, the slave economy expanded rather than contracting. Brazil's sugar plantations in the Northeast, Coffee plantations in the southeast and gold mines inland demanded more and more labor, and that labor came by the millions from Africa. By 1822, when Brazil declared independence from Portugal, nearly half of its population was enslaved. But unlike the US or Haiti, Brazil's fight for freedom was not a slave revolt. The ruling class, white, landowning, and deeply invested in slavery, ensured that independence preserved their profits, not upended the hierarchy. There was no civil war, no revolution. Instead, there was slow erosion of excuses, of justifications, of moral legitimacy. In the 1830s, a powerful pressure emerged. Britain, as the leading naval force and self-proclaimed enforcer of anti-slavery treaties, Britain began aggressively targeting Brazilian slave ships. In 1845, it passed the Aberdeen Act, authorizing the Royal Navy to seize Brazilian slavers on the high seas. Brazilian elites protested. But the tide had turned, yet abolition was still a distant dream. Within Brazil, the enslaved pushed forward every inch of resistance they could. Legal suits for freedom were filed in courts, often citing ancestry or illegal capture. Quilombos, the settlements of runaway slaves, continued to grow in the hinterlands. In urban centers like Rio de Janeiro, enslaved people began buying their own freedom, often with money earned through side work. But the state pushed back. Freedom was conditional, expensive, and rare. In 1871, Brazil passed the law of the free womb, a law that declared all children born to enslaved mothers would be free. On the surface, it looked like a step forward. In reality, it meant that children would be free, but forced to work for their masters until adulthood. It was emancipation on a leash. 12 years later, the sexagenarian law of 1885 freed enslaved people over 60 years old. But these individuals had already spent their lives in bondage. Few lived long enough to benefit. And those who did were often cast out, too old to work, and without compensation or support. Slavery persisted, and so did resistance. In cities such as Recife, São Luís, and Rio de Janeiro, abolitionist movements gained momentum. Newspapers, writers, students, and even parts of the urban middle class began to challenge the moral and economic logic of slavery. Runaways increased. So did the boldness of urban black activism. Many enslaved people no longer waited for laws to change. They fled in broad daylight, sought protection in churches, or formed alliances with sympathetic citizens. By the 1880s, Brazil was under pressure, both internationally and internally. The image of a slave empire in the modern age was costing Brazil its reputation. Then came 1888. On May 13th, Princess Isabel, acting as regent in the absence of Emperor Pedro II, signed the Lei Áurea, the Golden Law. Just 2 sentences long, it abolished slavery in Brazil without compensation to the enslavers and without land or reparations for the freed. There were no grand ceremonies, no government apology. Freedom came, quietly, belatedly, insufficiently. Over 700,000 enslaved people were freed that day, on paper. But what followed was not jubilation. It was displacement. Newly freed men and women were cast out, with no land, no education, and no protection. Many ended up in urban slums, begging or doing the same work for pay that barely differed from bondage. The elites, angry at the loss of their property, began to withdraw support for the monarchy. Within a year, Brazil's empire collapsed. In 1889, the monarchy fell, replaced by a republic. However, for the formerly enslaved, true freedom remained elusive. No reconstruction, no land grants, no systemic investment in black futures. Freedom had arrived, but equality had not. Brazil's path to abolition was a complex journey marked by hypocrisy, resistance, and compromise. It was not led by the powerful, but forced by the powerless. The enslaved bought their freedom, sued for it, ran for it, fought for it, sang for it, and finally won it. After nearly 400 years of bondage, but the battle for dignity, land, and opportunity would take much longer. And in many ways, it is still being fought. More than a century has passed since Brazil formally abolished slavery. Yet in many ways, its shadows stretch across the present, woven into the very fabric of modern Brazilian life. The chains are gone, but the systems they built remain. From the favelas on Rio's hillsides to the courtrooms, classrooms, and boardrooms of São Paulo, the legacy of slavery echoes not just in memory, but in numbers, neighborhoods, names, and narratives. Slavery in Brazil was not a footnote. It was the backbone. Over 4 million Africans were forcibly brought to Brazil. More than any other country in the Americas, nearly half of Brazil's entire population in the 19th century was enslaved. That scale left scars not easily erased by a signature on paper. When slavery ended in 1888, it was with no compensation, no land, no integration plan, and no effort to include formerly enslaved people into Brazilian society. They were freed and abandoned. Their descendants, now over 50% of the population who identify as Black or mixed race, Pardo, continue to experience the ripple effects of centuries of exclusion. Let's look at the numbers. In education, Black Brazilians are still underrepresented in universities, though affirmative action quotas introduced in the 2000s have begun to make a difference. In income, white Brazilians earn nearly double what Black Brazilians make for the same roles. In policing, the disparity is deadly. More than 75% of people killed by police are Black, often young men in low-income neighborhoods. This is not coincidental. It is systemic, rooted in post-slavery policies that deliberately excluded Afro-Brazilians from the nation-building process. After 1888, Brazil's ruling elites promoted European immigration to whiten the population and workforce. Italians, Germans, Portuguese, and other Europeans were offered land, housing, and resources to settle in Brazil, opportunities that were never extended to newly freed Africans or their descendants. This strategy, known as branqueamento, whitening, was not just demographic. It was ideological. Blackness was treated as something to dilute, erase, or hide. Afro-Brazilian culture was criminalized and marginalized. Candomblé and capoeira, two central expressions of Afro-Brazilian spirituality and resistance, were banned or suppressed well into the 20th century. Afro-textured hair, African names, and skin color became silent barriers to opportunity, both socially and economically. Even Brazil's self-image, the myth of a racial democracy, obscured these realities. The country often claimed it had no racism, pointing to its mixed population and absence of segregation laws. But in practice, structural inequality thrived behind a mask of harmony. In recent decades, resistance has grown louder and more visible. Afro-Brazilian leaders, artists, academics, and movements have reclaimed space in politics, media, and education. The rise of Black consciousness movements, especially since the 1970s, has reframed national conversations around race, justice, and memory. In 2003, Brazil declared November 20th as Black Consciousness Day, honoring Zumbi dos Palmares, the leader of one of the largest Quilombos, runaway slave communities, in colonial Brazil. Afro-Brazilian identity is now proudly expressed through music. From samba to hip-hop, Black culture shapes the nation's soundtrack. Festivals, Carnival, once a symbol of elite culture, is now also a canvas for Afro-Brazilian pride and protest. Academia. Universities are producing groundbreaking scholarship on Afro-Brazilian history, culture, and inequality. But the struggle continues. Quilombo descendants, known as Quilombolas, still fight for legal recognition and land rights. Many live in rural poverty, with poor access to healthcare, education, and infrastructure. In cities, systemic racism persists in job hiring, housing, healthcare access, and policing. Political representation of Black Brazilians remains disproportionately low, especially in federal leadership, and violence remains a daily threat. Marielle Franco, a Black LGBTQ favela-born councilwoman in Rio de Janeiro, was assassinated in 2018, a symbol of both progress and the backlash against it. The legacy of slavery in Brazil is not confined to museums or textbooks. It lives in the geography of poverty, the language of power, and the faces of resistance. However, there is also hope. In the growing acknowledgement of history, in the cultural resurgence of Afro-Brazilian heritage, and in the emergence of a new generation of Brazilians who refuse to be silenced or sidelined. Understanding Brazil today means confronting its past, not to linger in shame, but to chart a more just future. The descendants of the enslaved did not inherit only trauma. They also inherited the strength of survival, the brilliance of culture, and the fire of resistance. And that legacy, too, shapes Brazil. The story of slavery in Brazil is monumental, but it does not stand alone. It is one strand in a vast web that stretches across oceans, continents, and centuries. The transatlantic slave trade, which brought millions of Africans to Brazil, also shaped the destinies of the Americas, Europe, and Africa itself. The legacy of that system, its consequences, contradictions, and scars, continues to define the modern world. Between the 1500s and 1800s, over 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Nearly 5 million of them came to Brazil, making it the single largest destination for enslaved Africans. But the ripples didn't stop at Brazil's shores. In Africa, entire regions were devastated. The demand for captives sparked brutal wars, depopulated vast areas, and dismantled stable kingdoms. African leaders and merchants, under the pressure of European guns and gold, became entangled in a trade that consumed their people and their futures. The loss of millions of young, strong individuals meant stunted development, collapsed labor systems, and fractured societies. And long after the trade ended, the impact lingered in weakened economies, artificial borders, and post-colonial struggles that still haunt the continent. In Europe, the profits of slavery fueled empires. Portuguese cities like Lisbon and Porto thrived on sugar, tobacco, and gold extracted by enslaved hands. The wealth financed cathedrals, fleets, palaces, and colonies. European banking, shipping, and insurance industries grew fat on human suffering, profiting from the logistics of bondage. The Enlightenment, that age of reason, was built atop a global contradiction. Philosophies of liberty and equality blossomed in societies that enriched themselves through slavery. In the Americas, slavery became the foundation of entire economies. From Brazil's sugar fields to the American South's cotton plantations, the enslaved built the wealth of the Western Hemisphere. Cities like New York, Boston, Havana, and Salvador became global trade hubs, not despite slavery, but because of it. The racial hierarchies used to justify slavery were not erased with abolition. They were baked into national identities, codified into laws, and reinforced through culture, religion, and education. Even after emancipation, the world did not say, "We were wrong." Instead, it said, "You are free, but stay at the bottom." So, how does this global legacy manifest today? In economic inequality. The descendants of enslaved people in Brazil, the United States, the Caribbean, are more likely to live in poverty, have limited access to education, and face barriers in housing and healthcare. In racism and colorism, ideas of whiteness as superior, born during slavery to justify domination, continue to shape beauty standards, hiring decisions, and media representation worldwide. In national myths, countries built on slavery often struggle to tell the truth about their origins. Instead, they teach narratives of bravery and discovery, leaving out the chains that bind. In cultural resilience, despite everything, the descendants of the enslaved have preserved and transformed their heritage. Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Caribbean, and African-American cultures have given the world music, dance, literature, cuisine, and spiritual traditions that are not just vibrant, they are defiant. Capoeira, samba, jazz, reggae, gospel, hip-hop, candomblé, carnival, soul food, storytelling. Each is a form of survival. Each says, "You tried to erase us. We became unforgettable." The global legacy of slavery is also being challenged. Museums across Europe are finally confronting their colonial pasts. Universities that profited from slavery are reckoning with their histories. Activists are demanding reparations, not just financial compensation, but also justice, recognition, and reform. The rise of global movements like Black Lives Matter has linked struggles across borders, showing that racism is not local. It is systemic and shared. In Brazil, too, this reckoning is underway. Quilombo communities are fighting for their legal rights and ancestral lands. Black artists and scholars are reclaiming history and reimagining identity. Young Brazilians are asking hard questions. Who built this country? Who benefits from its forgetting? History is not just what happened. It's what we choose to remember, and what we choose to build from that memory. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most horrific crimes in human history. But the story does not end in chains. It continues in the strength, brilliance, and resistance of millions who refuse to be defined by pain alone. Understanding the global legacy of slavery is not about guilt. It is about clarity. It is not about shame. It is about responsibility. Only by tracing the actual cost of empire and the actual value of those who endured it can we begin to build a more just world. And in that way, the legacy of slavery does not end in sorrow. It becomes a call to truth and to action.